The courtroom was suffocating. Not because of the air, perfectly conditioned and still, but because of the weight of power pressing down on everyone inside it. At the center of it all sat Judge Perry Calloway, a man whose presence alone could crush the spirit of anyone standing before him. His reputation preceded him: merciless, calculated, and utterly void of sentiment. Faith, in his eyes, was nothing but an excuse for weakness, a delusion people clung to when they couldn't handle reality. He had abandoned all notions of God long ago, and he had no patience for those who still entertained the fantasy. So when he saw the woman standing before him, gripping a massive old Bible against her chest, he couldn't stop the slow smirk that spread across his face. "Miss Elle Hargrave," he drawled, tapping his gavel against the desk lazily, "tell me you're not here to preach. Because I have to warn you, I don't do well with fairy tales." A soft chuckle rippled through the audience. Perry leaned back in his chair, completely at ease. He had seen desperate people try many things to sway his courtroom: tears, lies, manipulation, but never had anyone been foolish enough to try and use scripture against him. Elle didn't laugh. She didn't blink. She stood still, her expression unreadable. She had spent years waiting for this moment, and she wasn't about to waste it. She took a slow step forward, carefully placing the Bible on the table in front of her. The thud of its weight against the wood echoed through the silent room. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, controlled, "I came here today for one reason: justice. And I believe justice should be served, no matter where the truth comes from." Perry scoffed, shaking his head. "Truth," he repeated, rolling the word around like it was something bitter in his mouth. "Let me give you a piece of truth, Miss Hargrave. This is a court of law, not a church. If you think quoting scripture is going to—" "You misunderstand me," Elle interrupted, her voice cutting through his like a blade. She ran her fingers over the Bible's cover, her touch deliberate, precise. Then, slowly, she opened it. "I'm not here to convert you, Judge Calloway," she said, her eyes locking onto his with cold certainty. "I'm here because inside this book is the one fatal mistake that will bring your entire career to an end." For the first time that afternoon, Perry's smirk disappeared. The air in the courtroom shifted, tense, expectant, waiting. Whatever amusement he had before was gone, replaced by something darker. For the first time in years, Judge Calloway felt something unexpected. Doubt. What a twist! If this courtroom moment gave you chills, just wait for what's next. Like the video and subscribe to stay tuned for the next chapter. Turn on notifications so you don't miss a single reveal. What secret do you think is hidden in that book? Drop your theories in the comments. The weight of Elle's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The audience, moments ago entertained by the judge's arrogance, now sat in absolute silence. Even those who didn't understand the full scope of what was happening could feel it. Something had shifted. Elle wasn't just here to make a statement. She was here to unravel something big. Judge Perry Calloway stiffened in his chair. He was a man of control, a master at keeping his composure, but there was something in the way Elle spoke his first name, as if she knew him, really knew him, and that was impossible. He had spent his entire career keeping his past locked away, buried under layers of carefully crafted power. He leaned forward, his fingers tightening around the gavel. "I don't know what you think you know, Miss Hargrave, but I suggest you tread carefully," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "This is a courtroom, not a stage for baseless accusations." Elle didn't blink. She slowly flipped through the Bible, her fingertips brushing across the delicate pages with purpose. She wasn't searching, she had already found what she needed. And then, stopping on a specific passage, she let out a small, knowing breath. 17 years ago, she said, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. That's how long you've been running from this. For the first time in years, Perry felt it, doubt. His stomach tightened, but he refused to show it. His grip on the gavel remained firm, yet his mind was already racing. 17 years ago. A different courtroom. A different case. A decision that should have never been made. Elle lifted her gaze and met his eyes with cold certainty. You thought no one would ever find out, didn't you? And just like that, the ground beneath Perry Calloway's world began to crack. For years, Perry Calloway had prided himself on being untouchable. He had built his reputation on absolute control, carefully crafting a career where no one, not a single soul, could ever challenge his authority. Every ruling, every case, every strategic move had been designed to fortify his power. He had silenced opponents, buried secrets, and erased the past like it had never existed. But now, staring at Elle Hargrave as she stood before him with a calm, unwavering gaze, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. A crack. A sliver of doubt. He tightened his grip on the gavel, his fingers curling around the polished wood as if he could squeeze the uncertainty out of his mind. "Miss Hargrave," he said, his voice carrying the sharpness of a blade, "I don't know what kind of spectacle you're trying to put on, but let me remind you, this is a court of law. If you're expecting to shake me with vague, baseless accusations, you're wasting your time." His tone was firm, almost bored. Almost. Elle didn't blink. She let the silence stretch between them, letting the weight of her next words settle before she spoke. Then, slowly, she placed a hand over the worn cover of the Bible. Her fingers traced the leather edges, a motion that seemed almost casual, but it wasn't. 17 years ago, she said, her voice measured and deliberate, a man stood in a courtroom just like this one. He was sentenced under your ruling. She tilted her head slightly, watching him. And then, Judge Calloway, that man disappeared. A ripple of unease spread through the courtroom. A few whispers broke out in the crowd, but Perry barely heard them. His pulse had quickened, only slightly, but enough for him to notice. He kept his expression unreadable, but inside, his mind was already racing. That case, it was gone. Erased. No records, no paper trail, nothing. He had made sure of it. So how in the hell did she know? The sound of the gavel slamming down echoed like a gunshot. "That's enough," Perry snapped, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He sat forward in his chair, eyes dark with warning. "I will not tolerate reckless allegations in my courtroom. If you have nothing of legal value to present, I suggest you—" Elle's lips curled into the faintest smile. She had him. She could see it now, the tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the gavel just a little too hard. He wasn't angry. He was cornered. "Oh, I have something," she murmured, her voice soft but lethal. "Because you see, Judge Calloway, I found the case you tried to erase, and I have the proof to bring you down." For years, Perry Calloway had prided himself on being untouchable. He had built his reputation on absolute control, carefully crafting a career where no one, not a single soul, could ever challenge his authority. Every ruling, every case, every strategic move had been designed to fortify his power. He had silenced opponents, buried secrets, and erased the past like it had never existed. But now, staring at Elle Hargrave as she stood before him with a calm, unwavering gaze, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. A crack. A sliver of doubt. He tightened his grip on the gavel, his fingers curling around the polished wood as if he could squeeze the uncertainty out of his mind. "Miss Hargrave," he said, his voice carrying the sharpness of a blade, "I don't know what kind of spectacle you're trying to put on, but let me remind you, this is a court of law. If you're expecting to shake me with vague, baseless accusations, you're wasting your time." His tone was firm, almost bored. Almost. Elle didn't blink. She let the silence stretch between them, letting the weight of her next words settle before she spoke. Then, slowly, she placed a hand over the worn cover of the Bible. Her fingers traced the leather edges, a motion that seemed almost casual, but it wasn't. 17 years ago, she said, her voice measured and deliberate, a man stood in a courtroom just like this one. He was sentenced under your ruling. She tilted her head slightly, watching him. And then, Judge Calloway, that man disappeared. A ripple of unease spread through the courtroom. A few whispers broke out in the crowd, but Perry barely heard them. His pulse had quickened, only slightly, but enough for him to notice. He kept his expression unreadable, but inside, his mind was already racing. That case, it was gone. Erased. No records, no paper trail, nothing. He had made sure of it. So how in the hell did she know? The sound of the gavel slamming down echoed like a gunshot. That's enough, Perry snapped, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He sat forward in his chair, eyes dark with warning. I will not tolerate reckless allegations in my courtroom. If you have nothing of legal value to present, I suggest you— Elle's lips curled into the faintest smile. She had him. She could see it now, the tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the gavel just a little too hard. He wasn't angry. He was cornered. Oh, I have something, she murmured, her voice soft but lethal. Because you see, Judge Calloway, I found the case you tried to erase, and I have the proof to bring you down. 4 years, Judge Perry Calloway had crafted his world with absolute precision. Every case he presided over, every ruling he handed down, every connection he forged was carefully calculated to ensure that he remained untouchable. He didn't make mistakes. He couldn't afford to. Power wasn't just something he held, it was something he was. Yet, as he sat there, gripping his gavel, staring at Elle Hargrave, he felt something he hadn't felt in 17 years. Pressure. The courtroom was silent, yet the weight of 1,000 unspoken words pressed down on the space between them. Elle stood tall, her expression unreadable, the worn Bible resting on the table in front of her like a weapon she had every intention of using. She didn't shift uncomfortably, didn't hesitate, didn't break under his scrutiny. That alone was unsettling. Perry exhaled slowly, keeping his posture rigid, controlled. Miss Hargrave, he said, his voice steady but sharper than before. If you have a legal argument, present it. Otherwise, this court will not tolerate baseless accusations. His fingers tightened around the gavel, pressing into the smooth wood. He was already calculating his next move. Elle didn't blink. Instead, she opened the Bible, and for the first time since the trial had begun, Perry felt his stomach tighten. A single folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages, landing softly on the wooden table. The sound was deafening. Perry's eyes flickered to it for just a fraction of a second, but Elle caught it. She saw the momentary lapse. She saw the flicker of recognition, the smallest crack in the walls he had built so meticulously around himself. You know what this is, don't you? Elle's voice was calm, almost too calm. She picked up the paper, turning it between her fingers as she spoke. 17 years ago, a man stood before a judge just like you. He was accused, sentenced, and then he vanished. Her blue eyes locked onto his, her gaze cutting through him like a knife. No appeal. No records. No trace that he ever existed. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Tension crackled in the air, thick and suffocating. Perry's grip on the gavel tightened. He was still composed, he had to be. But inside, his mind was moving too fast, calculating, searching, running scenarios. That case was gone. There were no remaining documents, no evidence, nothing for her to find. Unless— Elle unfolded the paper slowly, deliberately. Her expression didn't change, but when she spoke, her words landed like a hammer. You buried the case. She placed the paper back on the table. You thought no one would ever find it. A pause, just long enough to let it sink in. But I did. The courtroom erupted. The courtroom was in chaos. Gasps, whispers, murmurs of disbelief swirled like a storm around the room. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notepads, cameras clicked, and a wave of unease spread through the onlookers as they processed what had just happened. Perry Calloway did not move. He sat rigid, his grip on the gavel unrelenting, his jaw locked so tightly that a dull ache spread down his neck. But inside, his mind was racing. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to regain control, to shut this down before it spiraled further. Across from him, Elle stood calm, collected, unwavering, a stark contrast to the growing madness around them. Her fingers hovered over the document, her confidence unshakable. She had planned this. She had been waiting for this moment. And Perry knew, for the first time in years, that he was facing a real threat. He lifted the gavel. One sharp crack against the wood. "Enough," he barked. The room fell into silence, but the energy had changed. The fear in his voice had not gone unnoticed. Elle's lips curled into the faintest smile. She had him. Perry forced a breath through his nose. "Miss Hargrave, I am giving you one final warning," he said, his voice low, controlled, or at least pretending to be. "If you do not present tangible, admissible evidence, I will have you removed from this courtroom." Elle took a slow step forward. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto his. "This document," she said, tapping the paper lightly, "contains the missing testimony. The one that was supposed to be filed before the sentencing. The one that, if it had been allowed, would have exonerated a man." She let that word hang in the air. Exonerated. A new wave of murmurs swept the room. Perry's stomach coiled into a knot. Because she was right. He knew exactly which testimony she was referring to. And he had personally made sure that it was never entered into evidence. Perry forced himself to smirk, though his hands were sweating beneath the desk. "Testimony?" he scoffed. "From whom, exactly? A ghost? Because as far as this court is concerned, Miss Hargrave, there was never a missing witness in that case." Elle let out a quiet breath, almost like a laugh. But there was no amusement in it. She slid the paper across the table, stopping just inches from his reach. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "His name was Samuel Ellison, and you made sure the world forgot about him." For the first time, Perry's face changed. His smirk was gone. His expression turned cold, calculating, but beneath it, Elle saw something else. Fear. And now, what will Perry do? Will he be able to turn this around, or has Elle finally cornered him? Drop your theories in the comments below. Perry Calloway had spent 17 years forgetting that name. Samuel Ellison. The moment Elle spoke it, something deep inside him locked up, a reflex so immediate and so powerful that it nearly showed on his face. He held his breath for just a second too long. A mistake. The pause was small, barely noticeable, but Elle caught it. And so did everyone else. A slow, uneasy murmur spread through the courtroom, a wave of suspicion rippling through the audience. The name meant nothing to them, yet, but the way Perry reacted? That was enough. Elle tapped the folded paper once. "Samuel Ellison was convicted of murder," she said, her voice steady, precise. "A conviction that you, Judge Calloway, made sure was swift and absolute." She tilted her head slightly, studying his face. "But there's one problem with that, isn't there?" Perry forced himself to lean back, masking the panic crawling up his spine. He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Miss Hargrave," he said, "this is a desperate attempt to twist facts into some kind of absurd conspiracy. Samuel Ellison was a guilty man." He met her gaze, forcing his expression into one of indifference, even though his heartbeat was hammering in his chest. "And his case is closed." Elle's lips curled into something dangerously close to amusement. Is it? Another silence. Another shift in the air. Elle reached into her bag and pulled out a second document, placing it next to the first. Then, with slow deliberation, she unfolded it. "Because what I have right here," she said, running a finger across the text, "is a sworn affidavit from a witness who was never allowed to testify. A witness whose testimony would have changed everything." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Perry's pulse spiked. That testimony had been destroyed. He had made sure of it. He had made sure that the witness would never speak. His stomach coiled. Elle finally looked away from him, turning her gaze toward the people in the courtroom, toward the reporters scribbling furiously, toward the attorneys watching with wide eyes, toward the jury, who sat completely still, completely silent. Then, without breaking eye contact with them, she said, "This is the moment where Judge Calloway tells us that I'm wrong. That Samuel Ellison was guilty. That this testimony doesn't exist." She turned back to Perry. Her smile was gone now. "So go on, Your Honor," she whispered. "Tell them." Perry's throat went dry. Perry Calloway had spent his entire career silencing people like Elle Hargrave. People who dug too deep, who asked too many questions, who didn't know when to back down. But this was different. This wasn't just a nuisance, this was a threat. And the worst part? The longer he sat there, the more he realized he had underestimated her. The courtroom was dead silent. Every set of eyes flickered between Elle and Perry, waiting, watching. The air felt thick, charged with something heavy, something irreversible. Perry could feel the walls closing in, the weight of his own past pressing against his chest. Then, he did something he hadn't done in years. He reached for his glass of water. His fingers wrapped around it tightly as he lifted it to his lips, taking a slow, measured sip. It was a calculated move, meant to feign composure, to buy himself precious seconds to think. But even as he set the glass back down, he could see it in Elle's eyes. She knew. She knew that he was unraveling, and she was letting him. Perry cleared his throat and finally spoke, his voice controlled but laced with quiet fury. "Miss Hargrave, I've tolerated your theatrics long enough," he said, forcing a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You claim to have an affidavit from a so-called missing witness, but you haven't even read it aloud." He gestured toward the document with a slow wave of his hand. "So why don't you go ahead? Let's hear it." Elle tilted her head slightly, studying him. For a brief moment, she didn't say anything. Then, she slid the paper toward herself and began to read. "I, Elias Carter, swear under oath that on the night of June 14th, I was present at the location where the crime in question took place. I witnessed the real perpetrator flee the scene. Samuel Ellison did not commit this crime. He was innocent." The words hit the room like a hammer. Perry's pulse spiked. The murmurs in the crowd exploded into full whispers, reporters scribbled furiously, and even the jury, trained to remain neutral, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Elle set the paper down and folded her hands over it, her gaze burning into Perry. A sworn statement, signed and dated. This was filed before the sentencing. But it was removed from the record, denied entry as evidence. And there's only one person with the power to make that happen. The gavel slammed down hard. "Enough," Perry snapped, his voice louder than he intended. Too loud. Too desperate. Elle leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You had an innocent man convicted," she said. "And now the world knows." Perry's fingers curled into a fist. He wasn't just losing control. He was already losing. Perry Calloway had always believed in one absolute truth. Power belonged to those who controlled the narrative. For years, he had mastered this art. He knew how to twist facts, bury evidence, and silence those who stood in his way. He had built a career on commanding respect, instilling fear, and ensuring that no one ever dared question his authority. But today, the courtroom was no longer his. Elle Hargrave sat across from him, her hands steady over the affidavit, her gaze unwavering. The crowd had turned restless, murmurs of suspicion growing louder with every passing second. Even the court stenographer, trained to remain neutral, had stopped typing, her eyes flickering between Perry and the document in front of Elle. Perry knew what was happening. He was losing control. His fingers twitched against the gavel, but when he spoke, his voice came out harsher than intended. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "A so-called witness suddenly appearing after 17 years? How convenient." He let out a forced laugh, shaking his head. "This isn't evidence. It's a desperate stunt." Elle didn't react. She didn't flinch, didn't smirk, didn't look triumphant. She just watched him. And that was worse than anything she could have said. Because Perry realized she wasn't trying to convince him. She was letting him destroy himself. A beat of silence passed before Elle finally spoke. "Elias Carter's statement was filed at the time of trial," she said, her voice calm, precise. "It wasn't suddenly discovered. It was removed. Someone made sure that his words never saw the light of day." She tapped the document lightly. "And you were the only person with the power to make that happen." Perry felt the shift in the room. The crowd had stopped murmuring. They were just listening now, absorbing every single word, judging him. His stomach coiled. "This is absurd," he barked, slamming the gavel down. "Too hard." His own voice sounded foreign, frantic, defensive. "Even if this document was real, you have no proof that I was involved." Elle exhaled slowly, almost as if she had been waiting for him to say that. Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached into her bag and pulled out something else. A second document. A letter. She unfolded it with deliberate slowness and placed it on the table. The paper was aged, slightly yellowed at the edges, but the signature at the bottom? Crystal clear. Judge Perry Calloway. Perry's blood turned to ice. For 17 years, Judge Perry Calloway had lived with the absolute certainty that no one would ever find it. He had been meticulous. Every loose end tied up. Every record erased. Every question silenced. The case of Samuel Ellison had been buried so deep that even those who once knew the truth had either forgotten or been forced to forget. It was a closed chapter, a decision that could never be challenged. But now, here it was. The document sat on the table like a ticking bomb, its slightly yellowed edges betraying the years it had spent hidden. The official court seal at the top gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but Perry's gaze was drawn to something far more damning, the signature at the bottom. His own. Elle Hargrave said nothing at first. She didn't need to. The silence was doing all the work for her. The weight of the moment, the suffocating realization creeping into the room, pressing against Perry's chest like a slow, inevitable collapse. Then, with a deliberate slowness, she slid the paper forward. "This," she said, her voice even, controlled, "is the missing authorization order." She let the words settle before she continued. "The order that ensured Elias Carter's testimony never made it into the trial. The document that erased the only piece of evidence that could have proven Samuel Ellison's innocence." A murmur swept through the courtroom, growing louder, heavier, charged with something Perry hadn't heard before. Doubt. Suspicion. Disbelief. His throat went dry. He needed to regain control. "No. This is absurd," he barked, slamming the gavel harder than necessary. "Too hard. Too desperate. Even if this document were real, you have no proof that I personally..." Elle didn't let him finish. She reached into her bag and pulled out another document, a letter. Carefully unfolding it, she placed it on the table beside the authorization order. And then, without breaking eye contact, she said the words that shattered the last remnants of Perry Calloway's control. "Signed by you." For the first time, his mask slipped. For decades, Judge Perry Calloway had ruled his courtroom like a king. His word was final, his authority unquestioned. He had built an empire out of fear and control, ensuring that no one ever dared to challenge him. Lawyers adjusted their strategies to please him, defendants trembled under his stare, and witnesses knew better than to step out of line. But now, his own kingdom was turning against him. The letter sat in front of him, its presence louder than any gavel he had ever slammed. The ink had faded slightly over time, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. His own name, written in bold, confident strokes. His own proof of guilt. Elle Hargrave didn't look victorious. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat. That was the worst part. She just stood there, completely steady, letting the weight of the moment suffocate him. "You didn't just convict an innocent man," Elle said, her voice slicing through the silence. "You made sure no one could ever prove his innocence." She let the words settle, then tilted her head slightly. "How many others, Judge Calloway? How many lives have you erased?" A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Perry's grip on his gavel tightened so much that his knuckles turned white. He could feel the eyes on him, scanning him, searching for a crack, a sign of weakness. And for the first time, he realized they would find one. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, his voice losing the usual authority it carried. He lifted the gavel, his last desperate attempt to regain control. "This so-called evidence. Judge Calloway." The voice came from the prosecution's table. Perry's blood turned to ice. The lead district attorney had risen from his seat, a thick stack of documents in his hands. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they told Perry everything he needed to know. The system he had twisted to serve him? It was finally turning against him. And this time, no gavel could silence it. For decades, Judge Perry Calloway had ruled from the bench with an iron fist. His words carried the weight of absolute power. His gavel could end lives in a single strike, and no one, had ever dared to challenge him. He had built his career on fear, on carefully orchestrated rulings, on bending the law in his favor. But now, his kingdom was crumbling. The once unshakable walls of his courtroom felt smaller, suffocating, closing in around him. He could feel the weight of 100 eyes boring into him, waiting for a reaction, waiting for him to deny, to fight, to hold onto the power slipping through his fingers. But Perry couldn't move. His mouth felt dry, his fingers stiff against the gavel that had once been his greatest weapon. But now? It was useless. Elle Hargrave stood across from him, unwavering, the living proof that he had lost. She had played her game perfectly, waited for the right moment, collected every shred of evidence, and then exposed him before the very system he once controlled. She hadn't just taken away his authority, she had turned it against him. The lead district attorney stepped forward, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "Your Honor," he began, but he wasn't speaking to Perry anymore. He was speaking to the judicial board. Perry was no longer the one presiding. He was the one being judged. The prosecution formally requests an immediate suspension of Judge Calloway's duties pending investigation. He placed the stack of files on the table, the weight of Perry's own corruption landing with a dull, final thud. "In addition, we are filing charges for judicial misconduct, obstruction of justice, and the wrongful conviction of Samuel Ellison." Perry felt his stomach drop. The entire courtroom erupted. Whispers, shock, reporters scribbling frantically, cameras clicking. Everything was spinning. He had spent his life reducing men to nothing with a few words. And now, those same words were being used to erase him. Elle stepped forward, looking at him one last time. Not with victory, not with anger, but with certainty. "You spent your whole life controlling the law," she said, her voice steady. "But today, the law controls you." And with that, Judge Perry Calloway was no more. What did you think of this story? Perry Calloway finally got what he deserved, but what about you? What would you have done in Elle's place? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Now tell me, do you think Perry deserved an even worse fate?